Margaret Thompson stood at her kitchen window, watching the rain streak down the glass. At 68, she had grown accustomed to quiet mornings, but today felt different. The letter in her trembling hands bore an official seal she recognized from decades past. Her late husband, Charles, had served as a palace butler for 30 years, and she knew that crest well. The letter requested her presence at Buckingham Palace for a private meeting with Her Majesty. No explanation was given, only a date and time 3 days away. Margaret's heart raced as memories flooded back to the last time she had been inside those grand walls. It was 45 years ago, and she had never spoken of what happened that day to anyone, not even Charles. Margaret lived alone in a small cottage in Windsor, surviving on her modest pension. Her neighbors knew her as a quiet woman who kept to herself, tended her garden with care, and never missed church on Sunday. They had no idea that she carried a secret that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. As a young woman of 23, Margaret had worked as a seamstress in the palace. She was skilled with her needle and thread, often called upon to make urgent repairs to royal garments. Her gentle nature and discretion had earned her the trust of the royal household staff. But on one particular autumn evening in 1978, she witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Now, decades later, someone clearly knew about that night. Margaret's hand shook as she read the letter again. The formal language couldn't hide the urgency behind the summons. She wondered if this was connected to the recent changes in the royal family, or if someone had finally decided that her silence could no longer be guaranteed. The rain continued to fall outside, and Margaret felt as though the weather matched her troubled heart. She had built a quiet life around her secret, never imagining that she would be forced to confront it again. The thought of returning to the palace filled her with both fear and a strange sense of relief. Perhaps it was time for the truth to finally come to light. Margaret walked to her bedroom and opened an old wooden chest at the foot of her bed. Beneath layers of carefully folded linens lay a small wrapped package she hadn't touched in 45 years. Inside was a piece of evidence that could change everything the public believed about their beloved royal family. She had protected this secret through her marriage, through raising her children, and through becoming a grandmother. She had carried it through Charles's illness and death 2 years prior, but now it seemed her silent vigil was coming to an end. The cottage felt smaller that evening as Margaret tried to prepare herself mentally for what lay ahead. She cooked a simple dinner but found she had no appetite. The familiar routine of washing dishes and tidying up provided little comfort. Every creak of the old house seemed louder, every shadow darker. That night Margaret barely slept. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, remembering the young woman she had been. Back then she believed in the fairy tale version of royalty that most people cherished. She thought the palace was a place of honor and dignity, where noble people lived noble lives. How naive she had been. The secret she carried involved someone very close to the Queen, someone whose reputation would be destroyed if the truth ever emerged. Margaret had made a choice that night to protect not just one person, but the entire institution of the monarchy. She had chosen silence over justice, loyalty over truth. But now, as she faced the prospect of returning to the palace, Margaret wondered if she had made the right choice. The world had changed dramatically since 1978. People were less willing to accept blind loyalty to institutions. They demanded transparency and accountability, even from their royals. The next morning brought no relief from her anxiety. Margaret tried to maintain her normal routine, but everything felt different. When her neighbor Mrs. Patterson stopped by to chat over the garden fence, Margaret found it difficult to concentrate on their usual gossip about the weather and local news. As the days passed, Margaret began to prepare for her journey to London. She hadn't been to the city in years, and the thought of navigating the busy streets and crowds filled her with additional worry. But these concerns seemed trivial compared to the weight of what she might be asked to discuss at the palace. Margaret found herself looking at old photographs of Charles in his palace uniform. He had been so proud of his service to the royal family. She wondered what he would think about her being summoned back after all these years. Would he have wanted her to finally speak the truth, or would he have urged her to maintain her silence until the grave? The evening before her scheduled visit, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair and held the mysterious package once more. Tomorrow, she would face the consequences of a decision she made as a young woman. Tomorrow, her life of quiet anonymity would likely come to an end. But perhaps after 4 decades of carrying this burden alone, it was finally time to let someone else share the weight of her secret. The train to London felt like a journey back in time for Margaret. As the countryside rolled past her window, she clutched her handbag tightly, the mysterious package safely tucked inside. She had dressed in her best black coat and pearls, the same outfit she wore to Charles's funeral. It seemed appropriate somehow, as if she were attending another kind of ending. London's bustling streets overwhelmed her senses after years of quiet village life. The noise, the crowds, the constant movement, everything seemed too fast, too loud. Margaret had forgotten how different the city felt from her peaceful cottage. She took a taxi to the palace, her heart pounding harder with each familiar landmark they passed. At the palace gates, Margaret showed her letter to the guard. His professional smile faltered slightly as he read the document, and she caught him glancing at her with curious eyes. He made a phone call, spoke in hushed tones, then directed her to a side entrance she remembered well from her working days. A young woman in a crisp uniform met Margaret at the entrance. She introduced herself as Sarah, a private secretary, and led Margaret through corridors that sparked decades-old memories. The smell of furniture polish, the echo of footsteps on marble floors, the weight of history in every room. It all came flooding back. They walked past rooms where Margaret had once worked, past doorways she had hurried through as a young seamstress, but this time, she was being led to a part of the palace she had never seen before. The private offices where serious business was conducted away from public view. Sarah knocked on a heavy wooden door, and a voice called for them to enter. Inside, Margaret found herself face to face with Commander Robert Hayes, the head of Royal Protection. He was a tall man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a military bearing that made Margaret feel small and vulnerable. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, rising from behind his desk, "thank you for coming. Please have a seat." The office was elegant but intimidating, with oil paintings of former monarchs watching from the walls. Margaret perched on the edge of a leather chair, her handbag held protectively in her lap. Commander Hayes studied her for a moment before speaking again. "I'll be direct with you, Mrs. Thompson. We have reason to believe you possess information about an incident that occurred in 1978. Information that has never been officially recorded or investigated." Margaret's mouth went dry. After 45 years, someone had finally connected her to that terrible night. She had always wondered if this day would come, but she had hoped to take her secret to the grave. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said quietly. Though they both knew she was lying, Commander Hayes opened a file on his desk. "On October 15, 1978, you were working late in the palace making alterations to a gown for a state dinner. You were one of the last staff members in the building that evening." Margaret's hands trembled. He knew the exact date. Someone had been investigating, gathering information, building a case. But how much did they really know? "That same evening," the commander continued, "Prince Andrew was involved in an incident that was covered up by certain members of the royal household. We believe you witnessed something that could help us understand exactly what happened." The mention of Prince Andrew's name made Margaret's heart skip. She had hoped never to hear that name again, never to think about what she had seen him do that night. For decades, she had tried to forget the image burned into her memory. "Why now?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you asking about this after so many years?" Commander Hayes leaned forward in his chair. "Because certain allegations have surfaced recently. Allegations that could damage the monarchy if they're true. We need to separate fact from fiction, and you may be the only person alive who knows the real truth." Margaret thought about the package in her handbag. Inside was a piece of fabric, torn and stained, that could prove everything. She had kept it all these years as insurance, never knowing if she would ever need it. Now it seemed that moment had arrived. "What makes you think I saw anything?" Margaret asked, still trying to protect herself. "Because," Commander Hayes said, pulling out a photograph, "security footage from that night shows you leaving the palace at 11:37 p.m., nearly 2 hours after your shift officially ended. The question is, what kept you there so late?" Margaret stared at the grainy black and white image. There she was, a young woman hurrying through the palace gates, her face pale and her movements rushed. She remembered that night so clearly, the fear, the confusion, the terrible weight of what she had witnessed. "Mrs. Thompson," the commander said gently, "we're not here to punish you. We're here to protect the institution you served faithfully for many years. But we need to know the truth. Margaret closed her eyes and felt the weight of 4 decades pressing down on her shoulders. She thought about Charles, about their children and grandchildren, about the quiet life she had built around her silence. Was she ready to give all of that up? "If I tell you what I know," she said slowly, "what guarantee do I have that my family will be protected?" "You have my word," Commander Hayes replied, "and the word of Her Majesty herself. This matter will be handled with the utmost discretion." Margaret opened her handbag and looked down at the package inside. After all these years, was she finally ready to reveal what Prince Andrew had done that October night in 1978? Was she ready to tell them about the young maid who had never made it home that evening? The truth was more terrible than they could imagine, and Margaret wasn't sure the monarchy could survive it. Margaret's hands shook as she slowly opened the package in her lap. Commander Hayes watched intently as she unwrapped the fabric, revealing a piece of torn blue cloth stained with something dark that had faded over the decades. The silence in the room was deafening. "This belonged to Emma Walsh," Margaret said quietly. "She was 18 years old, worked in the kitchens. Sweet girl, always had a smile for everyone." Commander Hayes leaned forward, his expression grave. "What happened to Emma Walsh, Mrs. Thompson?" Margaret took a deep breath, preparing to speak words she had kept buried for 45 years. "That night I was working late on Lady Catherine's gown for the state dinner. I had taken it to the blue drawing room where the light was better. I was nearly finished when I heard voices in the corridor outside." She paused, her eyes distant as the memories came flooding back. Prince Andrew was supposed to be away at Naval College, but he had returned unexpectedly. He was with 2 other young men, friends from school. They had been drinking. The commander made notes as Margaret spoke, his pen scratching across the paper. "What did you see?" I heard Emma's voice first. She was protesting, saying she needed to get back to the kitchens, but they wouldn't let her pass. I crept to the door and looked through the keyhole. Margaret's voice broke slightly as she continued. Prince Andrew grabbed her arm roughly. When she tried to pull away, he became angry. His friends were laughing, encouraging him. Emma was frightened. I could see it in her face. The room felt colder as Margaret's story unfolded. I should have done something then, but I was terrified. Prince Andrew was drunk and aggressive in a way I had never seen before. He pushed Emma into the small storage room next to the drawing room. Commander Hayes stopped writing and looked up at Margaret. "Did you intervene?" "I tried to," Margaret whispered. I opened the door and called out, pretending I needed help with the gown. But it was too late. I heard Emma scream, then a terrible thud, then silence. The weight of Margaret's words hung heavy in the air. She had carried this burden alone for so many years, and finally speaking the truth felt both liberating and terrifying. When Prince Andrew and his friends came out of the storage room, they saw me standing there. Andrew's face was flushed and there was blood on his knuckles. His friends looked scared, but Andrew just stared at me with cold eyes. Margaret reached into her handbag and pulled out a faded photograph. "This is Emma. I kept her picture all these years to remember her face, to remember why I had to stay silent." The photograph showed a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She was wearing a blue dress, the same blue as the fabric Margaret had unwrapped. "What did Prince Andrew say to you?" Commander Hayes asked. "He told me I had seen nothing, heard nothing. He said if I ever spoke of that night, my family would suffer consequences I couldn't imagine. Then one of his friends, a boy named Philip, grabbed my arm and said they would make sure I never worked again. Anywhere." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. But the worst part was when Andrew said that Emma had been clumsy, that she had fallen and hit her head. He said it was an accident, but his eyes told a different story. The commander set down his pen and looked directly at Margaret. "What happened to Emma's body?" "They wrapped her in old curtains from the storage room. I watched from the shadows as they carried her out through a service door. I never saw her again." Margaret wiped tears from her eyes before continuing. "The next morning, the palace announced that a kitchen maid had left suddenly for a family emergency. No one questioned it. Emma had no close family, no one to search for her." Commander Hayes was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what he had just heard. "Mrs. Thompson, why didn't you go to the police?" "Because I was a working-class girl in 1978 and he was a prince," Margaret replied bitterly. "Who would have believed me?" And Andrew made it clear that speaking out would destroy not just me, but my entire family. She looked down at the piece of blue fabric in her hands. I tore this from Emma's dress when I found it in the storage room the next day. I kept it as proof, but I never had the courage to use it. The commander stood and walked to the window, his back to Margaret. Do you know what happened to the two friends who were with Prince Andrew that night? Philip died in a car accident 6 months later. The other boy, James, moved to Australia immediately after finishing school. I heard he died there in the 1990s. Margaret felt a strange sense of relief washing over her. After decades of silence, the truth was finally being spoken. But she also felt terrified about what would happen next. Mrs. Thompson, Commander Hayes said, turning back to face her, what you've told me today could destroy the monarchy. Are you prepared for the consequences of that? Margaret thought about Emma Walsh, about the young woman who never got to live her life, never got justice for what happened to her. Emma deserves the truth, even if it comes 45 years too late. The commander returned to his desk and picked up a secure phone. I need to brief Her Majesty immediately. This changes everything. As he dialed, Margaret clutched Emma's photograph and whispered a silent apology to the young woman who had haunted her dreams for nearly half a century. The secret was out, and there was no going back now. 2 hours later, Margaret found herself in an even more impressive room deep within the palace. The walls were lined with priceless paintings, and the furniture looked as though it had witnessed centuries of royal secrets. She sat across from a woman in an elegant navy suit who introduced herself as Lady Victoria Ashworth, the Queen's most trusted advisor. Mrs. Thompson, Lady Ashworth began, her voice measured and calm. What you've shared with Commander Hayes is extremely serious. Before we proceed, I want you to understand the gravity of this situation. Margaret nodded, still clutching Emma's photograph. The weight of her confession hadn't lifted as she had hoped. Instead, she felt as though she was sinking deeper into a world she didn't understand. We have reason to believe that Emma Walsh's disappearance was not an isolated incident, Lady Ashworth continued. There have been whispers, rumors, unexplained departures of young staff members during the late 1970s and early 1980s. This revelation shocked Margaret. She had always assumed Emma was the only victim, that what she witnessed was a terrible aberration. The thought that there might have been others made her feel sick. How many others? Margaret asked quietly. We're not certain yet. Records from that period are incomplete, and many staff members from those years are no longer alive. That's what makes your testimony so crucial. Lady Ashworth opened a thick file and spread several photographs across the table. Do you recognize any of these young women? Margaret studied the faces carefully. There was Sarah Jenkins, a laundry maid who had supposedly left to care for a sick mother. There was Patricia Morris, a young cook who had allegedly eloped with a soldier. And there was Diana Fletcher, a cleaner who had simply vanished one day without explanation. I remember all of them, Margaret said slowly. They all disappeared around the same time as Emma, within about 18 months. And they all worked in areas of the palace where Prince Andrew had regular access, Lady Ashworth added grimly. Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. The scope of what she had uncovered was far beyond anything she had imagined. Her one terrible secret was apparently connected to a pattern of disappearances that had been covered up for decades. What do you plan to do with this information? Margaret asked. Lady Ashworth closed the file carefully. That depends on several factors. The Queen is considering her options, but I can tell you that she is deeply disturbed by these revelations. At that moment, the door opened and Commander Hayes entered with another man Margaret didn't recognize. He was introduced as Detective Chief Inspector Alan Morrison from Scotland Yard's Special Investigations Unit. Mrs. Thompson, the Detective Chief Inspector said, taking a seat, I've been briefed on your statement. What you've described constitutes evidence of murder and possibly multiple murders. The word murder hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had always tried to convince herself that perhaps Emma's death really had been an accident, that Prince Andrew's rage had gotten out of control, but that he hadn't intended to kill her. The fabric you've preserved could contain DNA evidence, Detective Morrison continued. With modern forensic techniques, we might be able to prove definitively what happened to Emma Walsh. Margaret looked around the room at the three faces watching her intently. What would happen to Prince Andrew if the evidence proves what I saw? He would face the full force of the law, regardless of his royal status, the detective replied firmly. But Mrs. Thompson, we need your formal statement and we need that piece of fabric as evidence. Lady Ashworth leaned forward. Before you make that decision, you should know that the Queen would like to speak with you personally. Margaret's heart nearly stopped. In all her years working at the palace, she had never been in the same room as the Queen. The thought of facing the monarch with such terrible news about her own son was overwhelming. "When?" Margaret managed to ask. "This evening before you return home. She's cleared her schedule specifically for this meeting." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of formal statements and legal procedures. Margaret found herself repeating her story multiple times, each telling making it feel more real and more horrifying. The piece of blue fabric was carefully packaged and labeled as evidence, handled with scientific precision that made Margaret realize there was no going back now. As evening approached, Margaret was led through even more private corridors to a small sitting room she had never seen before. The room was comfortable and welcoming, with family photographs scattered on side tables and fresh flowers in crystal vases. When the Queen entered, Margaret struggled to stand, her legs weak with nerves. Elizabeth II looked older than in her official portraits, but her eyes were sharp and alert. She wore a simple dark dress and pearls, and her expression was grave. "Please sit, Mrs. Thompson," the Queen said gently. "I understand you have carried a terrible burden for many years." Margaret found herself fighting back tears. The Queen's kindness was unexpected and somehow made everything more painful. "Your Majesty, I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered. "I should have spoken up years ago." The Queen sat across from her, her hands folded in her lap. "You were a young woman faced with an impossible situation. I don't blame you for your silence." They sat quietly for a moment before the Queen continued. "What I need to know, Mrs. Thompson, is whether you are prepared to see this through to the end, regardless of the consequences to my family." Margaret thought about Emma Walsh, about the other young women whose faces she had seen in the photographs. She thought about all the years she had lived with guilt and silence. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said firmly. "Those girls deserve justice, even if it comes too late." The Queen nodded slowly, and Margaret could see the pain in her eyes. "Then we shall ensure they receive it." The next morning brought chaos that Margaret could never have anticipated. News vans lined the street outside her cottage, and reporters shouted questions through her garden gate. Someone had leaked the story, and the media was in a feeding frenzy. Margaret peered through her curtains at the crowd gathering outside. Headlines on newspapers visible through her window screamed about royal scandals and cover-ups. Her quiet life of anonymity was over forever. Her phone rang constantly until she finally unplugged it from the wall. The doorbell rang every few minutes as reporters tried to get her to speak. Margaret felt trapped in her own home, overwhelmed by the attention her confession had unleashed. Commander Hayes arrived at her back door around noon, having slipped through her neighbor's garden to avoid the media circus out front. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry about this," he said as she let him in. "We're investigating how the information was leaked." "This shouldn't have happened." Margaret made tea with shaking hands. "What does this mean for the investigation?" "It complicates things significantly," the commander admitted. "Prince Andrew's lawyers are already preparing his defense. They're claiming the allegations are fabricated, motivated by money or attention." The suggestion that she was lying for profit stung Margaret deeply. She had never wanted money or fame. She had simply wanted to do right by Emma Walsh after decades of silence. "The good news," Commander Hayes continued, "is that the forensic analysis of the fabric has begun. If there's DNA evidence, it will take time to process, but it could provide definitive proof." That afternoon, Margaret watched in horror as television news programs dissected her life and background. They interviewed former neighbors, distant relatives, anyone who might have known her. Some spoke kindly, describing her as honest and hardworking. Others seemed eager for their moment of fame, sharing gossip and speculation. The worst moment came when a reporter tracked down Margaret's daughter Susan in Manchester. Susan appeared on camera looking shocked and confused, saying she had no idea about her mother's secret and asking for privacy for their family. Margaret's heart broke watching her daughter's distress. This was exactly what she had feared for 45 years, that speaking the truth would hurt the people she loved most. By evening, Margaret felt completely overwhelmed. She sat in her kitchen, curtains drawn tight, listening to the voices of reporters still gathered outside. She began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. The doorbell rang again, but this time it was followed by a familiar voice calling her name. It was Sarah, her neighbor, who had been trying to check on her all day. "Margaret, dear, are you all right in there?" Sarah called through the door. Margaret let her in through the back door, grateful for a friendly face. Sarah immediately put her arms around Margaret and hugged her tightly. "I don't care what those reporters are saying," Sarah said firmly. "I've known you for 15 years and you're the most honest person I've ever met. If you say something happened, then it happened." The support from her friend brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "I'm so scared, Sarah. I never wanted any of this attention." "But you did the right thing," Sarah replied. "Those poor girls deserved someone to speak for them." That evening, Detective Chief Inspector Morrison called with an update. "Mrs. Thompson, I have news about the forensic analysis. The fabric you preserved contains DNA from 2 different people. One profile matches samples we have from Emma Walsh's personal effects that her landlady kept." Margaret's heart raced. "And the other profile?" "We're working on identification, but it appears to be male. We'll need to compare it with samples from Prince Andrew to confirm, but this is significant evidence." The call ended with arrangements for Margaret to be moved to a safe house while the investigation continued. The media attention had become too intense and there were concerns for her safety. As Margaret packed a small bag, she thought about how dramatically her life had changed in just a few days. She had gone from anonymous widow to the center of a royal scandal that was dominating headlines around the world. But despite her fear and exhaustion, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in 45 years: peace. She had finally spoken the truth about that terrible night in 1978. Emma Walsh's story was being told at last. The safe house was a small apartment in central London, guarded by police officers who were kind but professional. Margaret felt strange being away from her cottage and garden, but she also felt relief at being away from the constant scrutiny. Late that night, as she lay in an unfamiliar bed, Margaret thought about Emma Walsh. She wondered what Emma's life would have been like if she had lived. Would she have married, had children, grown old gracefully? All of that had been stolen from her by a moment of royal rage. Margaret drifted off to sleep holding Emma's photograph, finally feeling that she was no longer carrying her burden alone. The truth was out and there was no stopping it now. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more questions, and probably more media attention. But for the first time in decades, Margaret felt she was on the right side of history. She was fighting for justice, however late it might come. The investigation was just beginning, but Margaret knew that whatever happened next, she had done her duty to Emma Walsh and to all the other young women who had been silenced by royal power and privilege. 3 weeks later, Margaret sat in the witness box at the Old Bailey, facing the most important moment of her life. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal experts, and members of the public who had queued for hours to witness this historic trial. Prince Andrew sat in the dock, flanked by his expensive legal team. He had aged visibly since the scandal broke, his face drawn and his confident demeanor replaced by something resembling fear. Their eyes met briefly across the courtroom, and Margaret saw the same cold stare she remembered from that terrible night in 1978. The forensic evidence had been devastating for the defense. The DNA analysis confirmed that the blood on Emma's dress fragment belonged to both Emma Walsh and Prince Andrew. Additional evidence had emerged when investigators finally located Emma's burial site in Windsor Great Park, following information provided by a former groundskeeper who had been sworn to secrecy for decades. Margaret's testimony was clear and unwavering. She described every detail of that October night, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The defense lawyers tried to shake her story, suggesting she was confused by the passage of time or motivated by financial gain, but Margaret remained consistent. "Mrs. Thompson," the prosecutor said gently, "what do you say to suggestions that you have fabricated this story for money or attention?" Margaret looked directly at Prince Andrew as she answered, "I have lived with this secret for 45 years. It has haunted every day of my life. I would give anything to have been wrong about what I saw, but I wasn't wrong. Emma Walsh deserved better than she got that night, and she deserves justice now." The courtroom fell silent as Margaret's words hung in the air. Even the judge seemed moved by her simple, honest testimony. The trial revealed more than anyone had expected. 2 other former palace staff members came forward with their own stories of suspicious disappearances and cover-ups. During the late 1970s, a former royal protection officer testified about being ordered to dispose of evidence and falsify reports. Most shocking of all was testimony from James Crawford, Prince Andrew's school friend who had supposedly died in Australia. He was very much alive and had been living under an assumed name for 40 years. terrified that he would be silenced if he ever spoke about what he had witnessed. Andrew was in a rage that night. Crawford testified via video link from Australia. Emma had rejected his advances, and he couldn't accept that a servant would dare refuse him. When she tried to run, he grabbed her and threw her against the wall. The sound of her head hitting the stone. I'll never forget it. The defense's case crumbled as witness after witness contradicted their claims. Prince Andrew's own testimony was weak and evasive, full of claims that he couldn't remember details from that night due to drinking. On the final day of testimony, the prosecutor called an unexpected witness. A frail elderly man was helped into the witness box and identified himself as Thomas Walsh, Emma's younger brother who had been searching for her for 45 years. I never believed she just disappeared, Thomas said, his voice breaking. Emma would never have left without telling me. She was all the family I had left. Margaret watched through tears as Thomas held up a faded photograph of Emma. It was the same kind smile Margaret had remembered all these years, the same gentle eyes that had haunted her dreams. When the jury retired to consider their verdict, Margaret felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. She had done everything she could for Emma Walsh. Now it was up to 12 ordinary people to decide whether justice would finally be served. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation. The foreman stood and delivered the words that sent shockwaves around the world. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Prince Andrew showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but Margaret saw his hands trembling slightly. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, noting the particularly heinous nature of the crime and the decades-long cover-up that had followed. Outside the courthouse, Margaret was surrounded by reporters asking for her reaction. She kept her statement brief. This was never about bringing down the monarchy or seeking revenge. This was about giving Emma Walsh the justice she was denied for 45 years. I hope she can finally rest in peace. The aftermath was swift and dramatic. The Queen announced Prince Andrew's immediate removal from all royal duties and the stripping of his military titles. A full investigation was launched into Palace. Procedures and oversight of royal family members, Parliament, debated constitutional reforms to ensure that royal family members could never again escape justice for serious crimes. The monarchy survived, but it was forever changed by the revelations that had emerged from Margaret's courage to speak the truth. 6 months later, Margaret stood beside a simple gravestone in a quiet corner of the churchyard in Emma's hometown. The headstone read, Emma Walsh, 1960-1978, beloved daughter and sister. Justice at last. Thomas Walsh stood beside her, finally able to visit his sister's grave after 4 decades of not knowing where she was buried. The royal family had paid for a proper funeral and memorial, a small gesture that could never make up for what had been done but provided some measure of closure. Thank you, Thomas said simply, placing his hand on Margaret's shoulder. Emma would have been grateful that someone finally spoke for her. Margaret smiled through her tears. I only wish I had been brave enough to speak sooner. As they walked away from the gravestone, Margaret felt truly free for the first time in 45 years. She had kept her promise to Emma Walsh. Justice had finally been served, and the royal guard who had broken protocol to protect a prince's terrible secret had paid the ultimate price. The truth had set them all free, even if it had taken nearly half a century to emerge from the shadows of palace walls.